Okay, I want to just say a few words about um, Søren Kierkegaard. If I were to go over these pages that I've excerpted from this book, Fear and Trembling, if I wanted to actually go through all of this, it would be very long. It'd probably be another couple hours of video. So I'm not going to do that. I do want to just suggest one kind of theme or set of ideas as they relate to Plato's Euthyphro. This comes out, by the way, in 1843 in Copenhagen from this Danish philosopher. It's questionable whether he's a philosopher, but he's considered a philosopher by many, Søren Kierkegaard. Here's the theme I want to pick up from this story. Kierkegaard's considered by many to be the kind of father of existentialism and also a deeply Christian thinker. A deeply Christian thinker, who is so dissatisfied with other Christians and other religious people who are living in his time that he is taking up a kind of deeper investigation and inquiry into what faith would really entail. And in order to do that, he takes up this famous biblical story concerning Abraham, Sarah, and their son Isaac. And it's a story, as you perhaps know, Abraham is considered the father of faith of the three major monotheistic religions. And what Kierkegaard is investigating in this story is the kind of faith that Abraham has, and a kind of faith that perhaps is lacking and might even be impossible in modern or contemporary times. A faith that is, in fact, perhaps so impossible that it's incomprehensible. Why might that be? Well, it's because of the kind of test that Abraham is put through by God himself. What do I mean by this? So, with Plato's Euthyphro, we were just discussing, well, could it really be the case in the monotheistic concern? Could it really be the case that God could just determine or will or command the right thing to do? Could the right thing to do just be that which is commanded? By God? Sorry if this is a little messy. I'll try to write cleaner. Could the right thing to do just be that which is commanded by God? Because it seems as though with this story, this incredible story of Abraham, who is promised by God to be the father of all nations, it seems as though there are certain elements of this story which Søren Kierkegaard calls absurd. Or in fact, to be clearer, it's not so much that Kierkegaard calls it absurd. It's that this pseudonym that he's writing under, if you notice this, Johannes de Silentio, is revealing a kind of absurdity within Abraham's utmost faith. Well, what absurdities? Let me just identify two, and I'm not saying these are the only two. Here's one. Abraham is promised this son by God. He's promised that he will be the father of all nations in virtue of having a son with Sarah. And yet, they live to be extremely elderly, very old, past the point in which Sarah is able to have children any longer past her childbearing years. And yet, Johannes de Silentio or Kierkegaard is investigating, could it be that Abraham still really believed, still really had faith in the idea, that despite the fact that his wife is past childbearing age, he could still be the father of all nations in virtue of God's promise? Could he still trust God's promise in this way? Because in order to do so, it seems as though that would be an impossibility. And yet to have faith that he would still be the father of all nations would be a kind of faith in virtue of being impossible, which is beyond any and all reason. Something absurd, in other words. And now there's a second kind of absurdity which is drawn out in this story, which is through the attunement. The same kind of story is told in 4 different ways, and it's a real question. Why is Kierkegaard saying this in 4 different ways? There are reasons for this. There are interpretive reasons that we might offer, although I'm not going to get into all of those now. This story in which, finally after all these years, Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah. And then God commands Abraham to sacrifice his only son. And now and I said maybe I'll only point out 2 absurdities, maybe there's 3 at least. After all these years, after the first absurdity, it's now the case that he's asking, or even commanding Abraham to sacrifice his own son. And then we might ask, could Abraham again still believe that he would be the father of all nations, when God is now requiring him, after all of these years of waiting, to sacrifice his only son? And moreover, and this is the point which is even closer to Euthyphro, is this the right thing to do? This kind of insane or monstrous action, to sacrifice one's own son in virtue of the fact that God has commanded it. And what would it take, what kind of faith would it require in order to understand, if it's possible to understand, that this could be the right thing to do, that Abraham could have such a faith? And so this plays up into the kind of arbitrariness objection that we were concerned about in Euthyphro. Could it be the case that God could command Abraham in this way, to kill his only son, to sacrifice him? Or does this reveal a kind of arbitrariness in God's will? And yet, if it does represent an arbitrariness in God's will, part of what Kierkegaard is suggesting is that despite that, or despite the thought of that, beyond all kind of reason which would suggest a kind of arbitrariness or perhaps contradictory nature of God's will, Abraham still has faith. It's a kind of faith which goes through different stages, but it's a kind of faith in what it is that needs to be done. And so, again, I've said this a few times now, part of what Kierkegaard is after is that a kind of faith in God in this way extends beyond reason, any and all reason, perhaps, at least, into a realm of believing in the absurd, in believing that Isaac would remain alive somehow despite this sacrifice, that Abraham really would be the father of all nations, despite both Sarah's condition or elderly age, and being required to sacrifice Isaac. And this kind of immense story, this monstrous story on which the faith of all 3 monotheistic religions is based, in a sense. And it's a kind of faith which Kierkegaard, again, is suggesting is beyond anything that we might comprehend. I mean, if a person walked up to you and said, I was commanded by God to kill my son, you would think that they were crazy. I imagine. If you didn't, well, I think the rest of us would think that you're crazy. And so, Kierkegaard is suggesting there's a kind of religious aspect which is even beyond anything which might be considered ethical or moral. Anything ethical or moral could be perhaps stated, could be universal amongst human beings. And there might be something particular in its religious aspect, which is beyond the ethical or the universal in this way. Particular to Abraham in this case, and particular to Isaac, and the command to sacrifice him. So it's a large question. It's a large question which relates to the arbitrariness objection in Euthyphro. And it's a question you should perhaps consider as you're reading this piece from Kierkegaard. And one more thing. It's a kind of difficulty in relating to and understanding Abraham, and especially for a man like Kierkegaard, who's, by the third section of this reading, is going to write a speech in praise of Abraham. It's a difficult thing to get people ready, to get a reader ready, to attune a reader to a kind of speech which would be in praise of a man who is willing to go through with an action which everyone else would consider to be absolutely insane or monstrous. And so in asking yourself, could it be the case that the right thing to do, or the pious thing, is that which is commanded by the gods or a god? Does it seem as though that's something which is possible? Or how could we understand such an idea or understand such a claim, especially in relation to this foundation, if we want to call it a foundation, or at least this story, this set of stories about someone like Abraham? Okay, thank you. That's, I think, going to be it for the first half of the week. So I look forward to reading your comments and hearing your thoughts on the YouTube channel. Thank you.